So I say again, we start this morning session with Suliann Ben Hamed from Lyon, who will present her work on attention and perceptual decision making. Suliann.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. So I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation and the great talks we have been exposed to up to now. I changed a little bit my title, but I will be talking about attention and neuronal states of distractibility and impulsivity. I'm starting this talk with the well-known figure of William James for a reminder of the definition of attention. It is the taking possession by the mind in clear and vivid form of one out of what seems several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thoughts. It implies withdrawal from something. So in this initial definition, we have two concepts that are put forward by James: selection and suppression. Some people have translated this when defining covert spatial attention in the construct of an attentional spotlight that you can think at the mind as the mind's eye moving around in different feature dimensions in order to select a portion of space or information for further perceptual processing while simultaneously filtering out other sources of information. So again, this concept of selection and suppression. This concept is independent of eye movements, and this is going to be important for the rest of my talk. When one talks about covert spatial attention, we can imagine it along multiple features of selection. This can be space, so orienting attention in space. This can be any other type of feature, could be color, orientation, shape, mental content, etc. In the lab, the way we operationalize this is usually with this type of task where we ask subjects to fixate. We present, we cue them to one location where something very difficult to perceive is presented, and then we present distractors. And usually what we observe is the following type of relationship, such that the closer the distractor is presented to the expected target location, and the higher the proportion of false alarm produced by the subject, so error trials. This is taken as a signature of interference of the distractors in the perceptual decision-making process. So there is a wide range of literature that suggests that perception and perceptual decision-making strongly correlates with the ability of subjects to orient their attention to the instructed feature. And what we observe at the neuronal level is this type of responses in the multi-unit activities or the local field potentials, such that when a target has been selected by attention and perceived by the subject, you get a strong response modulation. And if in yellow, the subject has not perceived the target due to a misorientation of attention, you get this type of response. So basically, very weak, if any. In my lab, we have contributed to this relationship between the perceptual decision-making and attention. In most of the experiments I will be presenting, this is the setup. We are recording bilaterally from the prefrontal cortex in the frontal eye fields. We use multiple recording channels, 48 in total, and we have macaque monkeys performing complex attentional tasks of this type. The monkeys fixate. A cue is presented. They have to orient their attention to the cued location. A target is presented. The target is a very low luminosity change, so it's quite difficult. They have to respond by a manual response to get rewarded. And in order to make sure that they are orienting their attention to the cued location, we present distractors, and the job of the monkeys is to ignore the distractors and select the target. So let me show you. So we have developed real-time tracking methods from the neuronal population activity in order to track in real time the attentional spotlight. So what you see here is not the eyes, but is the location of the attentional spotlight as inferred from the prefrontal cortical activities, and I'm not going into the details of the methods. What you see here is abrupt changes in the trajectory, which we have called attentional saccades. And these attentional saccades happen at a frequency of 8 hertz in both monkeys. And we show that they are actually reset at Q time presentation. We have also shown that these saccades seem to be generated within the frontal eye field, which is indeed the source of covert spatial attention. In addition, we show that these saccades are under top-down control. So here I'm showing the attentional trace here mapped onto the screen in two different tasks, either a task in which the task items can happen in one of 4 possible locations, or only in one of 2 possible locations along the diagonal. And you see that the attentional trace in this task or this task in a single trial have a very different shape, and we can relate this probabilistically speaking to exactly the structure of the task, but I'm not going into these details. Importantly, what we show is that depending on the phase of these 8 hertz exploration of the attentional trace, we can identify both at target presentation and distractor presentation a phase at which prefrontal information about the sensory stimulus is maximized, and a phase at which overt behavior is maximized in terms of either hits here or false alarms here. What this means is that depending on when the stimulus is presented along those phases, either the prefrontal cortex is correctly perceiving these the sensory event, or is actually blind to these sensory events. If we push this a little bit further and we consider multiple types of stimuli that are presented in the task, we either have target predicted stimuli, distractor stimuli that are predicted by the monkeys, or another type of distractors that can happen anywhere in the workspace, and that this case are unpredicted. What we observe at the LFP level is this type of response that I've already shown. So strong response when the monkey is going to produce a hit, weak response before at the time of misses. Same thing here for this type of predicted distractor, with no response when the distractor is correctly rejected, and a strong response when the monkey is producing a false alarm. And when the distractor is unpredicted, this opposite pattern where we observe a strong response both for correct rejections by the monkeys and false alarms. At the neuronal level, this type of response maps on this type of plot, which I have already discussed. For the distractor, we observe a mirror response, that is to say, a neuronal response when the monkey is producing a false alarm to the distractor, so responding to the distractor, and no response when the monkey is correctly and proactively suppressing the distractor. For these unpredicted distractors, we identify a different type of processing of the stimuli, which is that on false alarm trials, there is a strong response to the distractor. On correct rejection trials, you see the sharp rise in the response, and then this deep suppressive dip in the response that we term a reactive suppression. As a result, we are actually describing 2 different mechanisms within the prefrontal cortex relative to distractor processing, either a proactive suppression of expected information, sensory information, and a reactive suppression of unexpected sensory information. Now we try to map the neuronal responses as a function of that attentional spotlight that we track in real time, what we observe is the following. What I'm plotting here is average normalized response rate as a function of the distance between the target and that dynamic attentional spotlight in blue. and in black is the behavioral performance. And what you see is that both curves highly correlate, and actually the closer the attentional spotlight to the expected target, and the higher the hits and the higher the neuronal response along a filter-like Gaussian shape, which corresponds to the hypothesized attentional spotlight. We observe the same spatial relationship between attention and distractor location for the predicted distractor, and this suggests that the selection of any type of stimulus, whether target or distractor, by the attentional spotlight corresponds to a failed suppression and a response to that target. Now, what is interesting is what we observe for this other type of distractor, the one that undergoes reactive suppression. And what we observe in this case is that the closer the attentional spotlight to this type of distractor, the opposite the relationship. You see here, there is actually a suppression of both the neuronal response and the false alarm rate, the closer the attentional spotlight to the distractor, meaning that in this case, what the attentional spotlight is operating onto the incoming sensory information is a suppression of the information. So in these slides, what I have shown is that indeed the tracking of attention in real time allows us to enhance the correlation between population neuronal activity and behavioral outcome, and our understanding of the contribution of attention to perceptual decision making. But and this is going to be the rest of my talk, the question is perception and the response of the subjects to the presentation of stimuli fully accounted by attention orientation? As you might guess, my answer is going to be no, that's not the case. And let's start from here. Now that we're able to track attention relative to the target, what we observe is that if we map the hit rate of subjects as a function of the distance between the attentional spotlight and the target, so the attentional spotlight is that metric we extract from the prefrontal cortex, what we observe is that when attention is very close to the target, indeed, monkeys produce a high hit rate, yet in up to 30% of the cases, they still produce errors, so misses. Likewise, if you consider these trials where attention was mapped very far away from the target, although subjects produce a lot of misses, they still do produce up to 50% of hits. And so the question is, why is it that this is the case? If you look at these single neuronal instances, what I'm plotting in color here, so this is one single neuron, this is target presentation. In blue shades are trials in which the monkeys produced a correct response. In green, trials in which the monkeys produced misses. And these trials are separated as a function of the distance between the attentional spotlight and the target. And so what I would like is you to focus on, for example, these two types of trials where in one, attention was very close to the target and yet the monkey produced a miss, or attention was at an intermediate level and monkeys produced hits. So at the neuronal level, it is impossible to predict from the pre-target activity what will be the behavioral outcome on these specific trials. At the population level, what I'm plotting here is a modulation index for attention for each cell recorded, and an index of behavioral outcome. So 0 for each index would be high modulation by attention or behavioral outcome. Higher levels would be high modulation by each of the two variables. In green, what I'm plotting is the cells that have a mixed selectivity, meaning the cells that encode both attention and behavioral outcome. And you see that there is a fair proportion of these cells. So the question is, how are these two variables represented at the neuronal population in the prefrontal cortex? In order to address this question, we apply the mixed PCA, that is to say that we impose the extraction of neuronal variability from the neuronal population to either attention task-related parameters or behavioral outcome. And as you can see, we are able to successfully assign part of the variability to attention, a substantial part of variability to behavioral outcome in the task, as well as an interaction term. If I just now focus on these two main terms, what we observe is that if we compute the angle between the two dimensions, these two dimensions of coding in the population, we observe that the angle is non-orthogonal. So just a methodological reminder, when you guys apply a PCA, you impose orthogonality in the decomposition of the variance. And what a DPCA actually does is that it allows a relaxation of orthogonality. And that's exactly what we measure here. So what does this relaxation of orthogonality mean in the data? What I'm plotting here is the dot product between these two dimensions, attention and behavioral outcome. This would be orthogonality, and this would be non-orthogonality. What I'm plotting here is the attentional, the benefit of orienting attention on the hit rate. So 0 is no benefit of orienting attention based on the decoding of attention from the prefrontal cortex, and higher levels are a benefit of orienting attention on the overall behavioral performance. And what we observe is this type of significant correlation between the two parameters, indicating that the more independent is attentional focus and behavioral outcome components, the more independent they are, the higher the behavioral benefit of orienting attention in the task. So in other terms, what this means is that probably orthogonalizing these two components is energy costly. It requires control from the animal, and the more successful is the control, and the higher is the information that can be drawn from orienting attention. In order to better characterize the computational nature of the behavioral outcome parameter, we went on applying DPCA on just the specific behavioral outcome component, but along 3 types of trial outcomes, so misses, hits, and false alarms. And in doing so, we are able to assign neuronal variability to 2 different components that have a completely different dynamic relative to the trial types. One is U-shaped, and the other one is linear. Interestingly, what we observe is that this type of U-shaped component actually correlates with a similar U-shaped component that we observe in noise correlation within the population, such that noise correlations are lower in hit rates relative in hit trials relative to misses and false alarms, while this linear trend correlates with how the and the same U-shape is also observed at, on how the system is processing the sensory information from the target presentation on these different types of trials. So in summary of this part, 2 elements. One, the fact that these 2 components are non-orthogonal, and the orthogonalization of these 2 components comes with a strong behavioral benefit of attentional processing. The other element is the existence of behavioral states that contribute to overt behavioral performance, one being linear and one being U-shaped and very reminiscent of the Yerkes-Dodson U-shaped curve. These are proposed to define an in-task optimal behavior state and two different states of distractibility and impulsivity that might actually have a quite important role in the advent of ADHD symptoms, including attentional impulsivity and hyperactivity. 2 or 5. Okay, so I'm actually almost done. So from there, we wanted to move to understand how these components express in time. And so now I will be discussing sustained attention processing in the prefrontal cortex along long periods of time. And I will start from a reminder on resource control model of sustained attention, where two opposite models confront each other, very reminiscent to what we have been exposed to in the last session of yesterday. One component is a progressive drop in attentional performance with time, and another model that proposes actually a rhythmic alternation between epochs of high performance and epochs of lower performance. In our hands, this is what we observe. I'm plotting here behavioral accuracy in the same task as I described earlier in time. And time here is at the scale of hours. So this is 1 hour, 2 hours, almost 3 hours. And you see these quite impressive changes in behavioral performance going from up to 80% to as low as 40% or lower. If we compare at the same time and in the same scale, the change in overall prefrontal cortex information relative to target sensory input, you see very much the same type of oscillations with epochs of very high reliable representation of the target by the prefrontal cortex and epochs of much lower reliable representation of the target. And these changes in behavioral rhythms can be assigned, and I have lost the pointer, I'm sorry, can be assigned to 5 to 7 cycles per hour, and the behavioral rhythm fully correlate with the prefrontal information content. These epochs of high and low attentional exploration actually correlate. Can you see my, yeah, they actually correlate with either phases of spatially precise orientation or of attention, or phases of more lousy orientation of attention as a function of the task instruction. And we can assign very specific changes at the neuronal level between the up phases and the low phases of these cycles in LFP power, LFP coherence, and spike field coupling, suggesting that these influences are not local to the prefrontal cortex, but are coming from other regions. Very recently, we have reproduced the observation of these very slow fluctuations in behavior, pupil size, and EEG signals in human subjects, and we're still exploring the behavioral underpinnings of these observations. And this brings me to my conclusion, which is the fact that the contribution of attention to perceptual decision-making seems to involve multiple mechanisms at multiple timescales, starting from a spatial attention control signal at an alpha frequency, mechanisms controlling in-task, out-of-task behavior in the neuronal populations, and much slower rhythmic mechanisms that we could term vigilance, alertness, or whatever at 4 to 6 cycles per hour. And on this, I would like to thank you for your attention and thank my collaborators on this work.
Before people decide to ask question, I have one. Could you elaborate a bit more on how you built this attentional spotlight? Because I think it's at the core of your method.
Yeah, I skipped that part. Basically, we use machine learning techniques where we associate initially the neuronal activity, the population neuronal activity, to the task instruction. So the initial hypothesis is that the monkey is indeed and attention is complying to the task instruction, and from there we map the probabilistic output of the decoder onto the spatial map, and we interpret the noise that is delivered by the decoder on each trial as actually a spatial information about the target. And in that specific work, we show that there's a correlation of the output of the decoder with the behavioral performance, indicating as a result that it's indeed mapping space. Yeah.
And just to be sure I understand well, their behavioral response is a motor response, so they are instructed to stay focused on the...
The eye is not moving, and the response is by hand.
Okay.
So it's a decoupling between the eye and hand.
Okay. Other questions?
In the meantime, maybe just to follow up, Suliann?
Sorry.
Just about the decoding, can you be a little bit more specific about which brain regions would be informative to?
Sorry, can you say that again? Which?
Just about the spatial location of the information you decode to infer what the attention is. What part of the prefrontal cortex?
It's the frontal eye fields.
Only?
Yeah, we are only using the frontal eye fields, but Tremblay, it all have applied the classification aspect of our work to dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So my guess is that if we applied exactly this method to that cortex, it would work in the same way. It's about the reason why we're able to do that is because the receptive fields are broad enough. That's a characteristic of FEF receptive fields, but also of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex receptive fields. So I would expect to see the same thing. And I don't think that in this respect, I would expect much of different functional differences between FEF and prefrontal cortex in all what I presented.
Okay, thank you, Suliann, for the great talk. In one of your last slides, you were showing some decoding performance using LFP and other metrics. And I noticed that with the LFP, it's kind of decreased through times. I don't know if, and do you have any comments on that? Do you have I don't know, why?
Yeah, that's super interesting. And we are trying to explore that, and probably it binds to the talk of yesterday on recoverable and unrecoverable components in long task performance. We indeed see that in some of our both behavioral and physiological metrics, some of them only have the recoverable component and some of them have the two components. So we still don't understand if this is due to a difference between the local inputs and the long distance inputs. We are going in that direction. And one of the experiments we've run is also analyze the contribution of noradrenaline in this respect. That's our key hypothesis. We are currently analyzing the data, and we hopefully will have the answer soon.